Okay, guys. So today's lesson's on imperialism, and before we really get into what imperialism is, which is mostly going to be on your own, looking at a crash course, let's talk about where we are in the 1800s in Europe, because a lot has happened since the middle 1700s. In the early 1700s, Europe is almost entirely agricultural. There's almost no industry to speak of. And European nations, although powerful in the world and reasonably wealthy, they don't control a lot of the world. Within about 100 years, all that's going to have changed, okay? And imperialism is just one part of that, but industrialization and nationalism is a big part of that as well. Now, you've already looked at industrialism and at nationalism. So let's talk about those just a little bit and talk about what effects those are going to have in Europe. First off, industrialization, and we've already talked about this extensively. With industrialization, you have Europe that is all of a sudden very wealthy, that has huge amounts of stuff, way more stuff than they know what to do with. They cannot consume all of those goods, so they want access to new markets. But they also need access to raw materials, especially for their textile mills. They need cheap cotton, they need cheap wool, they need cheap silk, okay? So that's going to fuel imperialism, a desire to go out and get that stuff, okay? Also, you have nationalism at play, right? By the 1860s, 1870s, you've got a lot of new nations that have formed, countries like Germany and Italy that hadn't really existed as single unified concepts before. And you have other nations like France and England that had existed as unified countries but now have a lot more national pride and a desire to prove that they are better, right? Because think about nationalism for a minute. Nationalism is about superiority. It's about this knowledge that your country is better than all the other countries out there, right? And that as a result, you have a duty, maybe even a responsibility to go and spread your glorious culture to the rest of the world. Okay, so if you're British, if you're German, if you're French, and you're filled with this nationalistic fervor, it makes sense that you would, justify. Well, yeah, we can go conquer Africa, no big deal, and then it'll be doing them a favor because our nation is so great, better than all the other countries, all right? So we have nationalism as a motive here. We have industry as a motive because we have the stuff necessary to conquer nations now. We have the guns, we have the uniforms, we have better medicine than we used to. And you also have a need for raw materials. We want more copper, we want more minerals, we want more coal, we want more textiles like cotton, okay? And you need to sell your stuff, okay? Because you're building too quickly, you're making too much stuff too fast, and you need markets for these goods. And places like China that have huge populations but are pretty wealthy as well are perfect markets for your goods, okay? So there's a lot that's driving European imperialism. And so what does this imperialism eventually look like? Well, it's going to be different everywhere. In China, you mostly have something called economic imperialism, where European nations are just forcing open the doors of trade, right? They're engaging in monopolistic trade practices, selling whatever, textiles or manufactured goods, or in the case of the British, drugs, opium, nothing sells like drugs, to the Chinese. In Africa and other less developed parts of the world, imperialism looks a little bit more stereotypically conquery, right? They're going in, they're fighting wars, they're conquering these places, and then they're using cheap labor supplies and cheap raw materials to benefit their own industrialization, okay? So that's really what imperialism is about. It is about the nations of Europe conquering the rest of the world, whether it's through economic forces, right? We're just going to conquer you in terms of trade, or through straight up, you kind of belong to us now and we're in charge and we're going to take your labor, take your raw materials and use them for our own benefit, okay? But the 1800s is just full of this kind of imperialism, all right? So this lesson has just a few components. It starts out with a quick discussion question, and it's very straightforward. I just want you to tell me what you think the strongest motivating force was for European imperialism and what they stood to gain from imperialism. Okay, so put up about a 100-word post on that, and then comment on somebody else's post. Then there's a crash course on imperialism that'll give you some more detailed information. I would like you to take notes on that. And then you have just a short 6-question quiz that covers the material that was in the crash course. You can use your notes on that. So if you watch the crash course and take good notes, you'll get all 6 questions right. No problem. And that'll be it for our lesson on imperialism. If you have any questions, please email me, all right? And yeah, best of luck learning about imperialism.